Great, thank you for joining. We will be starting momentarily. All right, welcome to, and thank you for joining today's Distinguished Speaker Series event at Bakersfield College, hosted by Bakersfield College Student Government Association, BCSGA, and the Office of Student Life, in collaboration with the BC History Department and the Women's History and More Committee, more lovingly known as WHAM. These webinars and many other student-centered events are only made possible by the BCSGA KVC Student Services Sticker Program, which students have the option to get at the time of registration. For more information, please visit bakersfieldcollege.edu/BCSGA. Just a few housekeeping notes before we begin. This webinar is streamed to various social media platforms and will be recorded to be made available up to 2 weeks after today's event for students. Closed captioning is available by clicking the closed caption button at the lower part of the screen. This is a webinar event, thus you will not be able to show your video or talk through your mic. The chat feature for this webinar has been enabled and will provide you the opportunity to engage with the panelists and other attendees. Please remember, all inappropriate questions and/or comments will be removed immediately. To pose a question, in the lower part of your screen, you will see a Q&A button. This is to submit your question to us. We will review the questions and ask them at the end of the speaker's presentation. We may either respond to the question live or respond to it via the module. The Distinguished Speaker Series brings community leaders from around the world to Bakersfield whose achievements have had national and international significance. Each speaker was proposed to BCSGA by either a department or a faculty member. The collaboration between many entities on campus make these events successful each year. The events are free and open to the public. All events this year were scheduled to be via Zoom platform on a virtual platform. For more information on future speakers, please visit bakersfieldcollege.edu/student events. Please note today's webinar will be recorded. In the case of technical issues, please stay online as we work through them. In the case of disconnection, please join us on Facebook Live at facebook.com/SGABC. If you have any questions, please ask them in the Q&A module and the moderator will get to respond them in time. As a reminder, we do have future presentations for the Distinguished Speaker Series coming up next month. Without further delay, I welcome to the stage Professor of History, Erin Miller.
Thank you, Nikki and Benny, and thank you, Elaine Weiss, for speaking with us today. As Dr. Damania mentioned, Women's History and More, which is affectionately called WHAM, is a committee of faculty and staff at Bakersfield College who organize a series of events every March to celebrate and commemorate women's contributions to history and to our society. WHAM is thankful to the Office of Student Life, BCSGA, Dr. Damania, Benny Valderrama, and Danielle Harris for all their help throughout the years and for today's event. Before introducing our speaker, on behalf of WHAM, I'd like to invite you to 3 additional events this month. While Ms. Weiss speaks today on the 19th Amendment, Women's History Month theme this year is Women, COVID-19, and its impact on our campus and our community. All of the events I will introduce will be held via Zoom, Facebook, and/or YouTube. On March 4th at 6 p.m., President Sonia Christian will host an Assemblywoman Emeritus Jean Fuller will moderate her 2nd annual leadership event with panelists Dr. Mary Barlow, Ms. Katie Russell, and Nicole Parra. On March 10th at 6:30 p.m., Professor Tina Mendoza moderates a panel on education called A Candid Conversation About Online Education in the Age of COVID, featuring panelists BCSGA Vice President Emma McNillis, Professor of Education Erica Menchaca, Director of Student Life Dr. Nikki Damania, and Professor of Academic Technology Matt Jones. On March 25th at 7 p.m., Professor Olivia Garcia will moderate a panel on health entitled A Dialogue About COVID-19, the Vaccine and Your Health, featuring panelists Michelle Corson, Connie Perez Andreessen, Jay Tamsi, and Bianca Torres. Now to our event today. We initially invited Elaine Weiss here last year to celebrate the 100th year anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, awarding the right for women to vote constitutionally. Elaine graciously agreed to speak with us today about her book, The Woman's Hour, The Great Fight to Win the Vote. The Woman's Hour is a biographical account of the battle to win the 26 states' ratification for the 19th Amendment. She situates this triumphant tale in a contest between powerful, inspiring characters, including Susan Anthony, Alice Paul, Carrie Catt, Frederick Douglass, and others. It's both a macro and micro history that could serve as a blueprint for political advocacy for today. The book is available for purchase at all the usual places, including the BC Bookstore. A little bit about Elaine Weiss. She's an award-winning journalist and writer, a quite prolific writer. Her magazine feature writing has been recognized with prizes from the Society of Professional Journalists, and her byline has appeared in The Atlantic, Harper's, New York Times, Boston Globe, Philadelphia Inquirer, as well as reports and documentaries for the National Public Radio and Voice of America. She has been a frequent correspondent for the Christian Science Monitor. Her long-form writing garnered a Pushcart Prize, Editor's Choice Award, and she is the proud MacDial Colony Fellow. Her first book, Fruits of Victory, The Woman's Land Army in the Great War, was excerpted for the Smithsonian Magazine online and featured on C-SPAN and public radio stations nationwide. Weiss holds a graduate degree from the Middle School of Journalism at Northwestern University. She has worked as a Washington correspondent, congressional aide and speechwriter, magazine editor, and university journalism instructor. At the end of Elaine's presentation, she will answer your questions, so please submit those via the Q&A. So with no further ado, I would like to thank and welcome Elaine Weiss.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Miller, and I'm just so pleased to be with you this afternoon, at least virtually, and help you kick off the celebration of Women's History Month and talk about the power and the potential of women organizing and stimulating change. I want to tell you a story, and this story is more than a century old, and yet it is very timely. It's a story about democracy, about America's ambivalence about true democracy. And that's certainly been a topic in the news lately. We've seen that democracy can be fragile and it must be nurtured and tended in order to thrive. It's a story that I want to tell you about voting rights, which is a very essential issue right now. It's a story about social justice, something that we talk about a lot these days, about the role of protest, about the power of citizen activists. And your state of California plays a very dramatic role in this story. And we're looking at the poster for the California women's suffrage campaign of 1911. So it's the story of American women's demand for the most fundamental right of a democracy, the right to vote. It was a demand that was once considered radical, crazy, subversive, impossible, but was slowly and methodically and through sustained effort eventually transformed into constitutional law. It became the 19th Amendment, the largest extension of voting rights in our history, giving the vote to half of the citizens of the nation who were not included when the founding fathers constructed our government supposedly by and for the people. And we just commemorated the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, women's right to vote, this last summer. In the broadest sense, this is a story of how change, even imperfect change, can be made in a democracy and in society. What it takes to make change, beginning with individuals and expanding into mass movements. This is an important conversation we need to engage in right now as we hear loud calls for fundamental change and how we've witnessed tens of thousands of our fellow citizens demonstrating in the streets for that change. And we saw millions of Americans going to the polls, again, in many instances, advocating for change. The 19th Amendment was not just a legal change, not just a constitutional change, not just an election law change. It didn't just double the national electorate. It didn't just make women full citizens for the first time. It marked a societal change, a cultural shift in the role and the rights of women. And that's what made it so controversial and so complicated and so difficult to achieve. And of course, that evolution of women's roles is still ongoing today. But it's just that kind of societal shift in hearts and minds, in attitudes and actions, manifesting finally into law, that will be required as we tackle inequality in our own time. The fight for women's suffrage was one of the defining civil rights struggles in our nation's history. It's one that cuts to the heart of what democracy means. Who gets to participate in our government? Who has a voice? When we say, we the people, do we really mean everyone? And of course, we are still asking that question today. This story of the suffragists, who were grassroots activists taking to the streets to confront injustice and inequality, is very relevant right now. Now, when you read the standard history textbooks, you'll only get a very brief and fuzzy idea of how American women won, and that active verb is really important. Won. The vote was not given to women. It was not granted to women. It was not afforded to women. As one suffrage historian recently put it, we took it. And that is very true. But if it's described at all, and it's usually just a paragraph or so in a survey textbook, it's usually described something like this. Women asked for the vote at the Seneca Falls meeting in 1848, and then they were given the vote by enlightened American men in 1920. Just poof, it just happened. No, that's not how it occurred. It required 3 generations of fearless activists working over 7 decades and over 900 campaigns to finally secure the vote for American women. And the culmination of that crusade, what we call the women's suffrage movement, came down to a fierce 6-week battle over ratification of the 19th Amendment, staged in Nashville, Tennessee, in the summer of 1920. And that's where my book, The Woman's Hour, takes place. In the summer of 1920, one last state was needed to ratify the 19th Amendment to the US Constitution, giving all women citizens in every state the right to vote in every election. 35 states had already ratified, and 36, or 3/4 of the 48 states then in the Union, were required for full ratification. And it turned out that Tennessee might be that 36th state. If the Tennessee legislature approved the amendment, it would become the law of the land just in time for the 1920 presidential election. But if the amendment failed in Tennessee, it could be delayed indefinitely and perhaps not enacted anytime soon. The enfranchisement of half of the citizens of the nation was at stake, and it all came down to Tennessee. Now, California women could already vote by 1920. How did that happen? Well, we'll discuss that more in a moment. By 1920, the suffragists had been fighting for more than 7 decades. Since that first outrageous demand for the vote was made by Elizabeth Cady Stanton at the Seneca Falls Women's Rights Convention in 1848. Now, at that time, in the mid-19th century, women's rights was really a contradictory phrase. It's useful to recall what American women did not have the right to do. They had very few legal rights. A woman was not supposed to speak in public. Now, that wasn't law, but that was custom. She was not really allowed to do what I'm doing for you right now, which is to speak publicly. She could not attend most colleges, most universities, or professional schools, and most occupations were closed to her. If a woman was married, she could not own her own property or control her own money or inheritance. Everything belonged to her husband. Her children also belonged to their father. A mother had no custodial rights. A woman could not bring civil suit, nor testify in a court of law, nor serve on a jury. And of course, she could not vote. Nevertheless, many of those attending the Seneca Falls meeting thought that asking for the vote was a terrible idea. It was too radical. It was too out there. It would make them seem ridiculous. And that's a good reminder that radical ideas, which at first seem shocking, can, with effort and sometimes with time, eventually enter mainstream thought. And in hindsight, those ideas always seem so obvious, no-brainers, but it takes foresight to see beyond that label of radical. When Elizabeth Stanton asked for support for her resolution at Seneca Falls, it looked like it was not going to get it and it was going to be voted down. But a young man who was in the audience stood up. He had driven his buggy 50 miles from his home in Rochester to attend the meeting. And he stood up and he supported Elizabeth Stanton's call for women's enfranchisement. And it was Frederick Douglass, young Frederick Douglass, just 30 years old, just 10 years out of slavery. And he stood up and he said, no, you must demand the right to vote. It will never be given to you, just as it will never be given to me as a Black man unless we demand it and unless we're willing to fight for it. And he convinced the other very reluctant participants at Seneca Falls to agree to Elizabeth Stanton's outrageous demand for the vote. And I think if it wasn't for that act by Frederick Douglass at Seneca Falls, we'd never hear about that meeting because it would not have been as consequential. And now it was no coincidence that Frederick Douglass showed up at the Seneca Falls meeting. He was invited because he'd been working with the women who'd organized the meetings, Stanton and Lucretia Mott and several others, because the women's rights movement actually grew out of the abolition of slavery movement. And the foremothers of the suffrage movement, Stanton and Lucretia Mott and Susan B. Anthony, were all abolition workers before they were suffrage workers. And abolition and suffrage were sibling causes through the Civil War until there was a heartbreaking split between the movements when women were left out of the voting rights of the 14th and 15th Amendments. Newly emancipated Black men were given the vote, but not Black women and not white women. And race would become a vexing issue for the suffrage movement, employed by the suffragists when politically convenient, but especially weaponized by the anti-suffragists who used race to argue against the idea of women's voting. In the years following the Seneca Falls meeting, tens of thousands of dedicated suffragists waged over 900 local, state, and national campaigns to win the ballot. They traveled hundreds of thousands of miles to do, as Susan Anthony described it, organize, educate, and agitate in tiny towns and big cities across the nation. They begin campaigning in horses and buggies. And by the end of the movement in 1920, They're campaigning in cars. They had to travel because they had to change hearts and minds about women's role in society before they could ever hope to change laws. And that is a crucial step, the education, the changing hearts and minds, the changing of attitudes. And we find ourselves in that step right now as we try to educate our fellow citizens on the urgent need for racial justice and institutional reform, for confronting climate change, gun violence, and a host of other issues. The suffragists accomplished this educational aspect, and it was a stupendous feat of organization without any of the travel or communication tools we take for granted today. When the movement began, passenger train travel was just in its infancy. There was no transcontinental railroad to California. The telegraph had just been invented. There was no typewriter. There was no telephone. And even in 1920, when my book takes place, radio is not yet in use. As one young woman in my publisher's office who read the manuscript came into my editor and said, wow, these women were amazing, but I don't understand how they could organize like this without Facebook. Well, they managed. They did. They had meetings and they organized rallies and they marched. They didn't wear pink pussy hats, but they did wear their marching uniforms, white dresses with yellow sashes. And when you saw Vice President-elect Kamala Harris wear a white suit to make her first speech after winning the election, and when you saw J.Lo wearing white when she performed at the inaugural ceremonies, they were honoring the suffragists. Now, it's hard to imagine how difficult, how brave a woman had to be to stand up publicly for political equality. It's not like today when we just say, okay, I'm going to go to that march. It was much more difficult. Suffragists endured contempt and ridicule in their communities, in their churches, in their clubs, even in their own families. They were pelted with rotten eggs and spoiled vegetables. They were attacked by mobs of angry men and boys. They were denounced as radicals, perverts, traitors, anarchists, bad wives and mothers, even Bolsheviks. We're going to look at some rather strong anti-suffrage propaganda material, like this one, What I Would Do with the Suffragists. And it's all about keeping women silent, shutting her up. Here's another one, Peace at Last. It's hard to look at, isn't it? And again, which do you want? Do you want your wife to be a loving mother at home, or do you want her to be a crazed zealot protesting for political equality on the streets? Suffragists were derided as unattractive, unsexed she-men. Why should an unattractive woman care about the vote? She should have a man who will vote her interests for her. The men who did support women's suffrage, and there were many, they were often called affectionately the suffragents, but they were belittled by anti-suffragists as Mabels and Nancys. I think you can guess which one of these drawings was supposed to be the suffragist. Suffrage was also depicted by the anti-forces as being a threat to the American family, that gender roles would be totally mixed up if women had equal political rights. And here you see one drawing, When Women Vote, and mom is smoking a cigar and reading the sporting news while dad is having to hold a screaming baby and knit his own trousers out of his wife's old skirts. Again, this is going to disrupt family life, according to the anti-suffragists. Here's another one. Election day. Mom sails out to vote and will leave dad with the screaming babies. The apocalypse is coming. Dad has to take care of the children. The suffragists weren't the anti-suffragists weren't subtle about what would happen to American men. They would be emasculated by this idea of women having political equality. And here's one of my favorites that expresses that view that suffragists were frightening bed of trouble. Now, in their quest for equal citizenship, the women of the suffrage movement employed a wide variety of stratagems and methods. And many of these, marches, which we've seen, demonstrations and picketing, which we're about to see, acts of civil disobedience, sophisticated lobbying and public relations operations, and legal test cases to the Supreme Court would be adopted by the civil rights campaigns later in the 20th century and in the 21st century. The suffragists were ingenious and fearless. They had to be. To test the prohibitions against women voting, Susan B. Anthony, Sojourner Truth, and about 200 other women across the nation actually voted in the 1872 presidential election. Here's a contemporary magazine illustration of that, showing Susan Anthony usurping Uncle Sam's hat. And this is entitled "The Woman Who Dared to Vote." Anthony was soon arrested, put on trial, and convicted of illegal voting in a federal election. "Is it a crime for a US citizen to vote?" she protested. And of course, that's still a valid question today, as so many of our fellow citizens are denied the right to vote without hassle. Now, failure of this voting experiment led to Elizabeth Stanton and Susan Anthony drafting a constitutional amendment, a federal law that would supersede all state laws prohibiting women from voting. It was introduced into Congress in 1878 by Representative Aaron Sargent of California, and it stalled there for 40 years. The amendment was voted down either in committee or on the floor of the House or Senate 28 times. Meanwhile, the suffragists worked to change voting laws in the states because it's states which have control over the voting rights and operations for their citizens. And we've learned a lot about that in this last election. Now, California women began agitating for the vote not long after the state entered the Union in 1850. And by the 1870s, they were taking action. In 1871, Ellen Van Valkenburg of Santa Cruz sued the county clerk for refusing to include her name in the register of voters. Her case went all the way up to the California Supreme Court, which ruled that no, she did not have the right as a citizen to vote. In 1879, California suffragists collected tens of thousands of signatures on a petition to amend the state constitution, which afforded the vote only to white males. But the petition was ignored. Now, soon after that, in 1884, the Los Angeles Women's Suffrage Association was formed, joining other suffrage groups already established in Northern California. And within the decade, California would be surrounded by Western states, which voted to allow women to vote in their jurisdictions: Wyoming, Utah, Colorado, Idaho. So pressure was building. And in 1893, the legislature in Sacramento actually passed a bill extending the right to vote to women. But Governor Henry Markham vetoed it, claiming that female suffrage was unconstitutional. Suffragists came back to the legislature and convinced the lawmakers in Sacramento to put a woman suffrage referendum on the ballot in 1896. Now, remember, only men could vote in these referendums to decide whether women deserved the right to vote. Susan Anthony and other suffrage movement celebrities toured California to drum up support for the referendum. California could be a turning point for the movement. It would prove that women's suffrage was viable not just in the sparsely populated Western states like Wyoming, but in the more populous centers like California. So Susan Anthony arrived in California in March and stayed straight through until the election in November. She was on the stump every day during that time, sometimes giving several campaign speeches in a single day. She spoke in lecture halls and churches and schoolhouses, and even from the rear platform of her special touring train, decorated in yellow flowers, the suffrage color. Hundreds of other suffragists spoke in their communities, including Naomi Bauman Anderson in San Francisco, an active advocate for suffrage, writing articles and giving speeches around the state, emphasizing the importance of the vote for Black women. But the referendum also had vigorous opponents, most notably the liquor industry, which feared women might usher in prohibition laws. And the Liquor Dealers League had enormous power in the state. So on election day, the referendum was crushed, with 60% of voters opposed to it, only 40% approving. It lost most heavily in Northern California, especially in San Francisco, which was then the largest city in the state. The suffragists were devastated, but they learned some valuable lessons, which they vowed to use next time. The decade between that defeat in 1896 and 1906 was a decade often called the doldrums in the suffrage movement. But that's not to say things were not happening, especially in California. The State Suffrage Association grew stronger, and the Northern and the Southern suffrage leagues merged. Suffragists were traveling by automobile to small towns and educating rural women about the importance of having a voice in the way they were governed. And they were marching, as these women in Oakland are in 1908. Suffrage clubs were forming. The College Equals Suffrage League in San Francisco for young women, students, and teachers. And here's the Berkeley College chapter. The Wage Earners Equals Suffrage League representing working women. The Political Equality League in Pasadena, attracting men to the cause. And the Votes for Women Club in San Francisco for women in poor immigrant neighborhoods. Now, most of these suffrage clubs were by custom segregated. So African-American women had already formed their own suffrage club. The Fannie Jackson Coppin Club in Alameda County was a center for Black suffragists led by Lydia Flood Jackson, who we see here, and Hetty Tilghman. By 1910, the suffragists were ready to try again, and they were able to place another suffrage proposition on the ballot for the election of 1911. And this would be the most intense campaign for the vote the nation had ever seen. California suffragists used the hard-won lessons of the 1896 defeat to refine their approach. And they mobilized more than 10,000 campaign workers. They distributed over 3 million pieces of literature and 90,000 buttons in Southern California alone. And they employed some novel campaigning techniques. They distributed playing cards and postcards and shopping bags. And it became quite a business. As we see here in this advertisement, we sell Votes for Women pennants, pins, and postcards. And the swag included Equality, a fundraiser for the Women's Suffrage Party of California. College Suffrage League held an art contest to design a poster, and this was the winner, Bertha Boyd's stunning Votes for Women painting, which became the symbol of the campaign. For an entire week in August, Stores in San Francisco featured the colorful poster in all the windows, often accompanied by festive decorations in suffrage yellow. And this image is still the most popular suffrage poster. You can still see it, you can still buy it online, and it's reproduced in many modern editions. The California campaign used electric signs and 8-foot-tall billboards and lantern slides to deliver the message of suffrage at night. Former President Theodore Roosevelt spoke to 10,000 people in the Greek Theater at Berkeley to support the cause. Suffragists spoke to male voters wherever they could find them, in factories, in union halls, in churches, in clubs. They spoke perched on soapboxes and street corners and from the backs of buggies and trucks and automobiles. And the Blue Liner auto took suffragists on speaking tours around the state and became a popular symbol of the campaign. California suffragists brought their campaign not just to men, but to women as well, who needed to be convinced. Maria de Lopez, a Los Angeles college educator, was a Spanish translator for the movement, helping to produce campaign materials in Spanish like this one. And she's credited with making the first suffrage speech in Spanish. Selena Solomons was a San Franciscan who understood that not all suffragists were middle class or wealthy women who could afford to work for the cause. She believed that the referendum defeat in 1896 was due in part because the suffragists had been elitist and they hadn't been able to make the movement make sense to shop girls or factory workers or immigrant women. So she founded the Votes for Women's Club in San Francisco to bring these women into the fold. The club hosted lectures and forums and cultural performances advocating votes for women. It offered nourishing meals for a nickel and a library well-stocked with suffrage literature. Solomon's hope was that the girl who comes to eat stays to read and to talk suffrage. Solomon organized the young women who dropped by for lunch to accompany her on canvassing missions in the south of Market area, where many working class women lived. And the canvassers also tried to convince the women's husbands, who often took a fair amount of convincing. As the referendum campaign drew to a close, suffragists were warned that the anti-suffrage advocates were determined to keep the referendum from winning, and they intended to play some mischief in the polls in San Francisco on election day. So Selena Solomon's Votes for Women Club mustered a battalion of poll watchers on election day, 1,000 women and men, to make sure the voting was safe and counting was honest. On election night, the results looked grim for the suffragists. Once again, San Francisco voted down the measure, and it barely passed in LA, and it only squeaked by in San Diego. Many newspapers announced the defeat of the referendum in their morning editions. The vote tally took a full 3 days. Does that sound familiar? But when the final results from the rural districts were in, the suffrage referendum had narrowly passed by the equivalent of 1 vote in each precinct in the state. Every vote really did count. California put the 6th suffrage star on the national map. It was the 6th state to allow women to vote. And the 4 million California women could vote. And the number of American women with full suffrage rights doubled overnight with this election. And here are California women registering to vote in 1912. But there were still 42 states where women could not vote and possibly never would be able to. The only hope was a federal amendment But that federal amendment was still stuck in Congress. The slow pace of progress in Congress and in the states stirred frustration and anger among suffragists. A new generation, the third, grew impatient. They were no longer willing to wait, to plead politely, to ask for their rights. They were willing to be aggressive and rude and disruptive. They were willing even to break the law. The movement split, as reform movements often do, over strategy and tactics. A young New Jersey woman named Alice Paul left the mainstream suffrage organization to take a new approach. Her National Women's Party picketed the White House and protested on the steps of the Capitol and burned President Woodrow Wilson in effigy. Hundreds of Women's Party suffragists were arrested and served time in prison for their civil disobedience. The suffrage prisoners were held in decrepit, vermin-infested cells. They were physically assaulted, clubbed, tied to the wall, not allowed to read or write or even to speak to one another. They communicated by singing. When they refused to eat, they were force-fed, tubes rammed down their noses. Finally, in 1919, after World War I was over, the federal amendment was finally passed by both houses of Congress and sent to the states for ratification. A year later, in the summer of 1920, the amendment was on the cusp of victory, or possibly defeat, as it arrived in Tennessee, because Tennessee was a dangerous place to stage this definitive battle for women's suffrage. Nearly all the other Southern states had already rejected the amendment, and all for the same racist rationale. They did not want Black women to be able to vote. Suffragists faced an uphill battle in Tennessee, but they had no choice. It was their last best hope. So all the forces for and against women's suffrage gathered in Nashville. There were powerful forces working against ratification in Tennessee, political, corporate, and ideological foes, each with their own reasons for opposing votes for women. Politicians who feared an unpredictable new voting bloc, clergymen who believed that women voting was against the will of God, corporations that believed that women might be bad for their business. But the most passionate foes of the 19th Amendment turned out to be women, anti-suffrage women. That women might oppose their own enfranchisement was really shocking to me. But many of these antis, however you want to pronounce it, were social and religious and cultural conservatives who feared that suffrage would bring about a profound and unhealthy shift in gender roles. It would endanger the American family, and we saw some of those images, and bring about what they called the moral collapse of the nation. It would alter private life, not just public life. And this is an important reminder that the debate over women's suffrage was never just a political argument. It was also a social and cultural and moral debate over women's rights and roles in society. It was a precursor to what we now call the culture wars. So all sides confront one another in Nashville, and it gets wild. There's bribes and booze and propaganda and blackmail, conspiracies and kidnappings and fistfights. The newspapers call it Suffrage Armageddon. The outcome remains in doubt until the very last moment. And I won't spoil it for you, but it does come down to a single vote of conscience by the youngest member of the Tennessee legislature, who receives a letter from his mother. Now, all this took place a century ago, but there are surprising and even unnerving modern themes to this story. It's a history that helps explain where we've been, but also where we are right now. It deals with topics which dominate our headlines today. voting rights and voter suppression, women's rights, inequality, dark money in politics, the role of religion in public policy, the politics of protest, and racism. Because the history of suffrage in America is inevitably a story about race. In Nashville, there were cries of white supremacy and states' rights. The Ku Klux Klan is invoked as a dog whistle, and the Confederate flag is waved in defiance. This is a photograph of the opening dedication ceremonies of the anti-ratification headquarters in the Hermitage Hotel in the summer of 1920, and again, using the Confederate flag as a defiant statement. And of course, we've seen a lot of that lately. It required courage and creativity, and most of all, persistence to change the mind of the nation and to change the Constitution to allow women to vote. There were more defeats than victories. There was betrayal and disappointment. The suffragists had to keep going to Plan B and to Plan C. Making change is never quick, and it is never easy. But I hope the story of the suffragists will teach a new generation of activists that protest is patriotic and necessary, but it must be followed by well-designed and sustained political strategies. The suffragists did not just march and demonstrate and picket. They also debated and lobbied and drafted legislation and campaigned. They even had to campaign during a time of pandemic. In 1918 and 1919, the influenza pandemic really changed the way they could operate. When they couldn't hold rallies and when they couldn't meet in person, they organized through the mail using the post office and even tacking up posters on trees. We know about being creative during a time of pandemic. And they did not rest after the 19th Amendment entered the Constitution. Carrie Catt founded the League of Women Voters, which is still working to educate voters and to help make access to the ballot easier. Alice Paul drafted the Equal Rights Amendment, which was introduced into Congress in 1923, and it is still not fully ratified. This history also reveals that reform movements are imperfect. The story of women's suffrage is both an inspiring and a cautionary tale. It's complicated, it's messy. There were moral compromises made to achieve success that should and do make us wince. White suffragists were too often willing to leave their Black sisters behind. And we must learn from these mistakes of the movement as well as from its accomplishments. Another lesson we learn is that the struggle to expand our democracy is ongoing. It was not accomplished in 1920. It is not complete today. While the 19th Amendment gave the right to vote to all women citizens, Black women and Black men in the southern states would not be able to enjoy their right to vote for another 4 decades. Jim Crow laws, poll taxes, literacy tests, intimidation, and violence kept them from the polls until the Voting Rights Act of 1965 provided legal remedy. Native American women and Asian American women were not considered citizens in 1920, and so they were not covered by the 19th Amendment, and they also had to wait decades longer to vote. In recent years, essential enforcement provisions of the Voting Rights Act have been gutted, and we see an alarming number of states enact laws restricting access to the polls for targeted voters. Since the November election, just a few months ago, in which a record number of voters participated, more than 250 bills to restrict voting in the future have been introduced in 33 state legislatures. Again, aimed at minority voters, again, making it harder to vote. Today, our responsibility is to protect the vote for all citizens. We cannot and should not except cynical attempts to rob citizens of their right to vote. Voting rights is not a partisan issue. It is the stress test of our democracy, and we are too often failing that test. It's also our duty to use that hard-won vote, not only in presidential elections every 4 years, but also in our state and local elections as well. Elected officials at the state and local level make policy that affects your life and determines your future. And in California's initiative system, important policy is often decided by popular vote. Use the power that you possess, the power won for you by the suffragists of the early 20th century, won for you by the bravery of John Lewis and Fannie Lou Hamer, and the fearless civil rights activists of the mid-20th century, and won for you by courageous and committed voting rights activists today, working to defend our right to vote. The vote is a prayer, as the suffragists call it. The vote is power. Your future and the future of our democracy depends upon it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elaine. That was amazing, and I hope it encourages people to purchase your book, The Woman's Hour. We have a few questions that I'm going to, some of them I'll read to you, some of them I'll re-articulate. These are a little bit more nuanced than the last one. You describe Anthony, Kat, and Paul as 3 generations of women suffragists fighting for the vote and citizenship rights, a nearly 70-year fight. That's a long time, but on the stage of world history and the oppression of women, it's infinitesimal. Why do we so often talk about how long it took instead of how rapidly the ideas of the American Revolution and the founding documents made the progress?
Well, I guess there are 2 ways of looking at it. My husband is an astronomer. And so he deals in light years. So we could look at it that way too. But in a human scale, when you think of a nation, the great experiment of democracy, which the United States professes to be, then you have to really think about the idea that for the first 100 and almost 50 years of our national existence, half of the nation was denied the right to vote, denied the right to have representation, denied the right to have a voice in how they were governed. They had to pay taxes, but they had no voice. And so I think that on a human scale, if you look at the United States, which is coming up on its 250th anniversary, you also have to realize that for the first 150 years, half of the nation was denied participation. And then, of course, for another 40 years, Black citizens in the South were denied their enfranchisement. And we still make it much more difficult, much more fraught to vote than we should. So I think if we look at it that way, in that kind of human scale, then yeah, it did take a fairly long time.
Excellent. So when you compare it to the life of the nation and the ideas the nation professes, that becomes the benchmark upon which you judge it.
Yes, that is. We'll leave those light years to my husband.
Yes. Excellent. So in the book, you mentioned Josephine Pearson quite a bit and anti-suffragists. Women being against their own rights and ability to exert their will on the government seems very foreign to many of us today. Would you talk a bit about Pearson and how she or others like her came to oppose their own rights in voice and representation?
Yeah, well, the anti-suffragists are truly fascinating. A a little scary to think, a little shocking to think that women would organize against the right to vote. But, you know, we often have issues and alliances where we might think that a group is voting against their own interests. And we've even had many instances where in my opinion, women are sometimes voting against their own interests. So I think understanding the anti-suffrage women is very important. And not only in an historic frame of mind, which I try to explain that some of these women were religiously conservative and believed that the idea of women demanding equality went against biblical teaching, because in their interpretation of biblical teaching, Eve was created to be subservient to Adam, and to question that, question God's plan, and question the whole validity of the biblical interpretation. So they are against women having those kind of equal rights. And I think there's, you know, a strain of that still in our population. Some women were culturally conservative, and we saw a lot of those illustrations where they think this is going to undermine the American family, undermine established gender roles, undermine the sanctity of marriage, where the man is supposedly the dominant and the king of the castle. You see him having to hold the babies. That was a threat. They saw that as a threat to man. So do we see echoes of that today? Absolutely. In a lot of the fights we've seen over gender issues, over bathroom issues, over marriage equality, we hear echoes of a lot of those arguments. And then there were some anti-suffragists who believed that politically women could get more accomplished without the vote. If they could stay above the fray and just use what was called soft power, their persuasive soft power that was extra legislative. It had nothing, they didn't need the vote. They could just talk to the men who represented them in the legislatures and they could get their way. Well, that was fine for wealthy, well-connected women, but for the shop worker, for the factory worker, for the immigrant, for the sharecropper, that was not going to work. They did not have that kind of access. And they needed to be able to vote directly for their representatives and have them listen as constituents. So I think that the rationale of the suffragists, and again, race comes into the anti-suffragist movement, especially in the South, because they threaten that this will allow, because the 19th Amendment does cover all women citizens, Black women will be allowed to vote. And they use that as a threat and say, you don't want that. We don't want that here in the South. So these are some of the arguments that Josephine Pearson and the Tennessee and the Southern Women's Rejection League promote in that final fight in Nashville. But it's arguments that not only echoed around the country, but also I think we still hear today.
Indeed, we do. You mentioned the ERA, or the Equal Rights Amendment, and that it was almost 100 years ago today that it was introduced for the first time. And it has still failed to be sufficiently ratified. Could you explain that a little bit more to the audience, please?
Sure. So when the 19th Amendment was finally ratified, Alice Paul, the leader of the National Women's Party, said, okay, fine, now we have the vote. Now it's time to level the playing field on all other aspects of women's rights, whether that was equality in education, in economic terms, in employment terms. Women needed these other constitutionally guaranteed provisions. And so she actually went back to law school. She already had a PhD, but she went to law school so that she could help draft this constitutional amendment. It was to be the next constitutional amendment after the 19th. And it's very simple. It's based really upon the 19th, and the 19th, the wording is similar to the 15th. And it basically says rights of citizens shall not be denied on account of sex. And it is introduced in 1923, and it sits there for 50 years before Congress deigns to pass it. It's even longer than suffrage. And that happens in the 1970s. And what mid to late 1970s. And what Congress does is it puts a deadline and says, well, it has to be ratified before this date. And it gets close to the, by that time there are 50 states in the Union, so it needs 38 states to ratify. And it gets close, but it doesn't quite make it. So Congress, under a lot of pressure from women's campaigners, it extends the deadline. And it looks like it's going to go through fine. And it's coming up to the final ratification in the states when a woman named Phyllis Schlafly, who does actually, there's an interesting maternal line. She actually comes out several generations back. She comes out of the anti-suffrage movement. It evolves into a conservative women's movement. And she and her Eagle Forum group of women are actually able to convince state legislatures to stop. And the Equal Rights Amendment does not reach ratification by the time of that second deadline. And it sits just in limbo for decades. It was taken up again in 2019. And so now 38 states have ratified, but either Congress has to take away that deadline that it imposed. What's probably going to happen, it's going to go into the courts. So we have to watch what's going to happen, but it has been just about a century. And this is what the suffragists feared might happen if they lost in Tennessee. So it's quite a chilling example of what they feared if they lost in Tennessee, which made the stakes and the drama all that more intense. But it is a very kind of sobering example of how this change, that is the nation ready for true equality? And I'll see how we answer.
It's perplexing to consider how women prevented their ratification of the ERA. So just a couple more questions. I'm going to combine two of them together. If you could answer them at the same time, that would be amazing. You write amazingly. You have a way of bringing the characters of the past and the struggles they fight against to life before the reader. What writing tips would you provide to people, maybe research tips, and what is your next project?
Oh, well, that's a great question. Well, I really did, one of my goals in writing the book, besides giving a good and honest and full nuanced history of what happened, was I wanted these women to be full-bodied, to be full people, because so often women who are, if they're mentioned in historical accounts at all, it's usually as being acted upon. It's usually as they are depicted as helpmates to men making history, or they are, confined to the footnotes. And I wanted these women to be known to my reader in all their complexity, in all their faults, in all their contradictions, in all of their vanities even. I wanted you to understand where their motivation came from. Why would anyone devote most of their lives to fighting for women's right to vote? You needed to understand that, to understand why they were there in Nashville, why they'd been there for 7 decades. And so to do that, I was able to go into primary sources. And of course, there are biographies of some of the more famous movement leaders that I deal with, but in many cases, I'm dealing with the second tier of suffragists who I find so fascinating, because there are millions and millions of women and men who are involved in this cause over the more than almost century that it's going on. And so I was reading letters that they wrote to one another, or that they reported back to Washington during the campaign in Nashville. I'm reading memoranda that they write to the file. I'm reading the what they call the card catalog of what they were saying about the men who they were lobbying. And so I'm also reading newspaper accounts, which were very full and very detailed. And from there, I could get their words from those letters, from those memos that they were, even from the marginalia, because some of this material, they're writing on the margins, and I could see what they're reacting to in sort of real time. And that's how I'm able, when people say, wow, did you make up that dialogue? Well, no, I didn't. An historian can't do that. There are 750 endnotes at the back. You don't have to read them, but every one of those is cited. And so I'm able to take my characters' words that they wrote, that they spoke and were recorded in newspapers. Some of them wrote articles about it. Some of them wrote memoirs. And so I have that. And that's what allowed me to kind of make them come alive, make them more full, flawed characters, if you will. And I hope allowed the reader to understand what motivates activists, what motivates political change, because everyone can be involved in it. But for the leaders, sometimes this leadership is thrust upon them, and sometimes they're not equal to the task. And so I wanted that to come through. I wanted the humanity of these women as leaders, as political actors, as very savvy politicians to come to the fore. And it was a great joy to write, because they were such fascinating people. I really do love narrative history, and that's the kind of history I write, which tells a story and has characters. One of my favorite things is for a reader to write to me, or in the old days when I used to be able to tour and meet all of you in Bakersfield or wherever I was going, people say, gee, I love your novel. I'd kind of laugh and say, well, that's great. And I'm so thrilled that you think my book reads like a novel, but it's not. It's history, and everything I write had to be cited, and it is cited, and the source for it is fully disclosed. But I'm glad that it reads like a novel, because that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to make this a great story to read, and through that you'll learn a good bit of history. I've started work on a new project. I'm not going to announce it completely, because we haven't actually made all the contractual arrangements yet, but I'm hoping it will sort of continue the story of women organizing for the vote, and we'll take it into the civil rights era in the middle of the 20th century.
And I can't wait to read that. So we have 2 more questions, unless some others pop in here. One is, you mentioned the 15th Amendment, and of course, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment were part of the Reconstruction Amendments. Can you talk a little bit about the impact of the 14th Amendment on the status and rights of women and their reaction to that, if that's something you considered?
Well, yeah, I do talk about the 14th Amendment, and I have to say that there is right now, I think it's on Netflix, an incredible like 6-part series on the 14th Amendment. It's called Amend, and I intend to watch it this week. I haven't gotten to see it yet, but I've heard it's great, so I recommend that. I also recommend a wonderful documentary that was made by PBS American Experience, and it premiered this summer, and it was replayed this fall, and some of you in the audience may have seen it. It's called The Vote, and it's really powerful. It is, I think, the best sort of visual film treatment. It's a great documentary. Has a lot of us as talking heads, but it has some eye-popping newsreel footage that a lot of us had never seen before. So it's really worth watching. It's very nuanced. It's really a very good treatment. The 14th Amendment, of course, we know is providing due process. There's just a lot packed into the 14th Amendment. It's hard to take apart all the strands, but the suffragists used the 14th Amendment in some of their court cases. Before ratification of the 19th Amendment, there were quite a few challenges to women's disqualification for the vote by law. And they use the 14th Amendment, which does talk about the right of citizens to vote. And they use that and say, well, we're citizens, so we should be able to vote. But that actually went up to the Supreme Court in, I believe it's decided around 1876. Minor versus Happersett, I think is it called. And basically the Supreme Court said, well, women are citizens, but they're in a special category of non-voting citizens. A strange concept. And this was actually a very dangerous precedent, and it was then used to restrict the vote, not only to women, but for minorities going forward. So the 14th Amendment was something that the suffragists tried to use to bolster their idea that as citizens, they deserve the vote. It didn't work, and that's why they had to go the route of the amendment. So they're working on several different levels all through the movement. They're working firstly on the state level, because the states are in charge of election law. We've learned that lesson. We all know how Georgia votes and how Pennsylvania votes. So they make the laws, and they're still in charge of the laws. That's in the Constitution. But federal law supersedes that. So they're working at the state level. When they realize that the states are coming along so slowly, remember, it's 1911 when California finally, after several tries, allows women to vote, and it's only the 6th state. They've been going for 50 years, and it's only the 6th state. So things are moving far too slowly, and they realize they're never going to get some states. My state that I live in, Maryland, would never allow women to vote, because that would include Black women. And so even New Jersey and New York, well, New York does allow women to vote in 1917, but Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Massachusetts, Connecticut, never. It would not happen. And so they're working on the state level. Then they see it's just not going to be possible in anyone's, they've already gone into the 3rd generation. They can't go centuries more. So they are working at the federal level too. They're also working in the courts. They're just trying every different path that they can find.
Excellent. So one final question, and I'll thank you in advance. for your excellent work and contribution to the important field of women's history. You mentioned the leadership and strategic skills of women like Kat and Anthony and others. From studying them all so closely, what tips would you give young women in becoming politically active or activist politically?
Well, it was very interesting when I delved into their lives, first of all, to see that the spark of seeing injustice, of noticing injustice, of being appalled by injustice, whether that's a personal sense of being affronted or a more generalized one, came rather young. And I was fascinated by that. And I tell some of those stories. I tell the story of Elizabeth Stanton, daughter of a judge, and sees that her father just tells the women who come to him for help that the law does not protect them, that there's nothing he can do to help them. And Elizabeth is so horrified by this that she is going to solve this by cutting out the offending sections of her father's law books that discriminate against women. And her father discovers this plot and says, no, Lizzie, you can't do that. You'll just have to grow up and, change the law. And he probably thought that was a great throwaway line, something so far-fetched. But of course, that's what she does. She spends her life trying to change that law. Carrie Cat has this moment in her mother's kitchen when she's 13, when she kind of comes face to face with the idea that her mother, who's very politically aware and very well read, is not going to vote on election day. And when she asks, why aren't you going to vote with the men and the hired hands who are not even literate, and the men in her family, including her father, laugh at her, and she's just horrified by this and embarrassed. And she kind of makes a vow to herself that she's going to do something to change it. And you see young people coming to that. You see today young people seeing the danger of climate change, seeing the danger of racial inequality, and say, I'm going to do something, I'm going to be involved. And so what I would say is that it takes more than signing a petition, though that's a good start. It takes more than liking something on Facebook. It takes even more than marching or being involved in a single campaign. It takes persistence and it takes strategy. And there will be many disappointments. And I think that idea that you lose an election and you give up, or you lose a campaign or a referendum and you give up, that's what these suffragists did not do. They just went back. They picked themselves up, dusted themselves off, and went back into the fray. And I think that is the main lesson. We have this great phrase that came from Elizabeth Warren in the Congress, and still she persisted. Well, that was the suffragists. They persisted, and that's what it's going to take to make change.
That's a great note on which to end. I would like to thank you, Elaine, in the Office of Student Life, Dr. Damania, Benny, Olivia, for being here, and for those who attended and who will watch later. Please pick up the book, The Woman's Hour, and we look forward to Steven Spielberg's representation of it on the big or little screen. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.